Thanks so much for joining this webinar, everyone. Really glad that you're all here. My name's Hillary. I work at MOFGA organizing educational programming, much of which we have moved online given the current state of affairs. So I'm really glad that you're all here on this sort of experimental online webinar. This is the third in a series of webinars aimed at beginner gardeners. And the first two were earlier this month, and the recordings are available on the MOFGA website if you're interested. We're hoping to have one of these webinars happen every month for the remainder of the season. So the next one will be toward the end of June, and it'll sort of be about what you need to be thinking about and doing in the garden in July. So sort of a smattering of different topics, what you can still be planting for the fall, upkeep on certain plants, that type of thing. So keep an eye out on the MOFGA bulletin, and on the MOFGA website, we'll be announcing that webinar and the subsequent ones as well. A little bit of housekeeping for tonight. Caleb is going to be speaking for, I think, around 45 minutes. So I'm really, really happy that Caleb has offered to do this presentation tonight. Caleb works at MOFGA, and I'll let him introduce himself further. So I think we can get started, Caleb.
Yeah, thanks, Hillary. So I'm MOFGA's crop specialist. I used to farm, grew up gardening with my parents, and got a degree at UVM in agronomy, and ended up getting hired for MOFGA, which brought me to Maine, thankfully. And I do this kind of programming for home gardeners, homesteaders, but a lot of my work is with farmers and helping them just when they have questions or thinking about ways that they can grow organically better than they already are, hopefully. And so I think without further ado, I'll get into this presentation just because I guess I was a little hazy on the time. I probably put too many slides in, so I don't want to dilly-dally, but folks can feel free to comment if you want me to slow down on something. It's better to understand it well than to rush through and not quite get it. So let me share my screen here. Getting ahead of the pests. I think Ben Franklin, for this topic, really hits it on the head of the nail with an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. The sooner you can find your pest problem and the sooner you can figure out what it is and do something about it, the better it's going to be almost always. Kind of goes without saying, but it can't be repeated enough. If you can stop something when it's an egg or when it's only one or two individuals before there's been reproduction, and then you have a really big population and there's just so much more to deal with, and they can really create a lot more of an issue for you. So in making this presentation, I kind of borrowed from some disease talks. And so I thought one thing that might be nice to talk about is what we call the disease triangle. And it's not a perfect fit for pest issues, but a lot of it is relevant. So the idea being that you can't have disease, or in our case, pest damage, show up all in a vacuum. You need three things. You need a host that's susceptible, so that's going to be your garden plant. You need the pathogen, the disease-causing agent, or the pest to be present, right? So you don't need to go spraying for leafhoppers if there aren't any leafhoppers around. It's just a waste of time and money, and potentially you're killing other insects that you'd rather not kill if you were doing that. And then you need the right conditions and environment for that pathogen or that pest to really thrive and take off and be able to do the damage to your crop that you want it to do. So if you only have two of these situations, you only have risk. You don't have, so you may still want to have some actions that you take, but you don't necessarily have to respond immediately. or it may just tell you need to be keeping a closer eye because you know that this plant is susceptible to this pest and this pest just showed up, or you know that you have tomatoes and it's really wet weather and that means fungus diseases are more of an issue. So if late blight is in the area, then you need to control it. But if late blight's not in the area, then you don't. And that's a common disease that people have questions about. Late blight is one that doesn't overwinter here. So you don't normally have to worry about it, except when it does show up. It does occasionally show up. It works its way up the coast. It does overwinter in Florida, where it doesn't really get that cold. So the way I'm going to go through this presentation is I have a bulleted list of like 10 sort of, not strategies, not necessarily the best word, but 10 thoughts about pest and disease management. And then I'm within each one, or within most of them, I'm going to go through a bunch of really common garden examples to kind of give that, like, here's the principle, the theory that we're talking about, and then here's the actual application of these really common garden pests that most people do see or may see. I know there's a lot of people taking up gardening this year for the first time, so I expect some of our folks here tonight are new gardeners, and I'm sure some of you are experienced. Anyway, the first step is, of course, healthy crops. And that's another one where it's like, yeah, of course I want healthy crops. So there's only so much you can do there, right? You're growing the healthiest crops that you can. But one thing you can do is you can select varieties that are disease resistant and pest resistant. And a good seed catalog usually lists ways in which one variety might be more susceptible to this or more resistant to this. Usually they don't tell you when something's susceptible, but they like to show off that this variety might be resistant to this disease or resistant to this pest. So that's one big choice. And we don't really need an example, right? We just know we want healthy plants that are going to be able to resist disease or pest pressure. The other one is crop rotation. And this is another one where this is going to come up later on. I'll talk about how it affects some of how we worry about other pests. But there's only so much crop rotation you can do on a garden scale. It's great to do crop rotation, but if you're only rotating 10 feet away, it's not really going to do much, especially for pests, because a lot of them are pretty mobile. There might be a few that, they're going to pop up in exactly where they were last year, and you just don't want to be right there. And there's some ways that can help. But if it's anything that can fly, rotating to the other corner of the garden may not make that much of a difference. If you have a bigger spot and maybe you have a garden in the back of the house and a garden in the front of the house, then you've got a little more flexibility, a little more power with your rotation, that it might be more helpful. With diseases, anything that's in the soil, then of course you always want to rotate. So it's best practice, but it's limited usefulness depending on your pest. This is to remind me that crop rotation can be thought of both in terms of space and in terms of time. So you might have a pest that only gets into brassica crops, and you say you had a bunch of brassica crops in the fall. Maybe you don't want to grow them in the spring so that the pest doesn't wake up from the winter and have food ready to go and be able to keep building its population up. If you can kind of starve them out if you skip half a season, or maybe you have a friend and you say, look, I'm doing all of our brassicas for you and me this year. You do all of them for both of us next year, and we'll do the swap with alliums or something like that. So there are other ways you can do crop rotation more effectively on a garden scale, but it might involve, somebody who lives a little further away from you. And then the other issue is that, you can rotate, and maybe you can rotate with a friend, but what's your neighbor doing? And are they putting the same crops right in the same spot, right next to the fence, right next to your crops? So there's only so much control you have there. Good weed control. This is the first one where we're actually going to get into an example. This, of course, you want to do good weed control anyway, but just to give you some more motivation, with diseases in particular, a lot of them require moisture in order to infect your plants. So if you have a really weedy row, or if you have really weedy spots in between the rows, that's reducing airflow, which means the leaves aren't going to dry out as quickly. And so, we often try to manage for good airflow, reduce moisture. And the other issue is that sometimes these weeds are alternate hosts, either for a disease or for a pest. And it depends on the disease, depends on the pest, depends on the weed. So you can't, best practice is just keep good weed control anyway. Here's my first example. Spinach leaf miner also gets into everything in the spinach and beet family. So that's spinach, beets, chard, and it's a real pest. You can see on the left here, there's the eggs. If you spot it there, you can squish those eggs. But you can see with that big population buildup that was in, this is actually a garden of mine from when I lived in Vermont. There's way too many eggs there, and every leaf looked like that. I wasn't going to be able to squish them all. That was not going to be an effective control. So the eggs hatch, and then the larvae burrow into the leaf, and they actually feed. Here's the larvae over here, kind of gross. They actually feed between the top layer and the bottom layer. So this is with the top layer of the leaf peeled back so I could expose them. But off on the right, you can see their mines. That's why they're called leaf miners, where they get in and feed on the leaf. And once they're in there, they're really protected. There's not like a bird would love to eat that, but it doesn't even see it. It doesn't know it's in there. So that's a tricky one. One thing you can do is if you can rotate, this pest overwinters in the soil. So after it's in that larvae stage, it gets big enough, like this one's really big, it's getting ready to pupate. So it would chew through the leaf again, drop into the soil and pupate, turn into a little cocoon in the soil, and then it would emerge as the adult form, which just looks like a house fly. It's just a little fly. And that's the form that they overwinter, is in the soil as that pupae. If you planted your spinach and your beets in one bed, there's a chance that, and you had leaf miner that year, of course, if you didn't see any leaf miner, then you worry about this particular one year. Of course, there's always a chance it flies in from neighboring areas. But anyway, what we're talking about is maintaining that population. Because if you only had one adult fly come out that had mated and was laying eggs, you could smush all those. There wouldn't be too many. You could do it all by hand control. But if you have a bunch, you don't want to grow spinach or beets there, or probably not even right next to that bed, because the next spring, the flies are going to emerge. They're going to mate, do a mating flight, and then they're going to seek out the crop. So you could either rotate and get really far away. You could rotate in time, like maybe I'm not going to do any spinach in the spring or any beets in the spring. I'm going to wait and do a later planting, and hopefully that first generation has nowhere to lay their eggs. And then you could also rotate far enough away and row cover. If the fly can't get at the crop, they can't lay their eggs, they're not a problem. And we'll get into row cover later. That's another tactic, exclusion. But here's the thorn in your side, is that because lamb's quarter, common weed, it's in most gardens, most farms, it's really closely related to spinach and beets. And so this same leaf miner, there it is. It kind of looks like bird poop on the leaf. That's actually the leaf miner in there. It doesn't do as well on that as it does on spinach or beets, but it's still fine. It's still living. It's going to drop into the soil and be ready to go. So if you think you're rotating away, but you actually had lamb's quarters where you're putting this year's crop, you might have a population already ready to go. And that's why good weed control is part of good crop rotation. And so part of that means knowing what your weeds are. There's a great book called Weeds of the Northeast, if you want to look into it more, and we can throw that into the chat later on. The next one, know what you have. And you can see I was kind of getting into this, right? I was talking about it kind of matters what crop you have, what weeds you have, and what pest you have. So the first step is knowing your own crop. Don't even try to read this. It's too blurry. It's more just to make a point. This is a breakup of all the different flowering plants. And the top are monocots. Those are closer to grasses, palm trees, corn, that all fits into that. And then dicots, and those are our broad-leaved plants. And that's where most of our garden crops are, but not all of them. So, for example, alliums, that is a subfamily in the order Asparagales. So you can see that means alliums are onions. They're a little more closely related to asparagus than they are to, say, brassicas, which are way down here. You know, if you look at that distance, think of that as relation and how closely related they are. And then beets, that's a whole nother order. Potatoes and sweet potatoes, they're in the same order. They're in separate families, but they're in the same order. Carrots, that's a whole nother order. We're not going to get into all of it, but just to kind of say, like, you know, if you think of brassicas, those pests that get into brassicas tend to only get into brassicas. Not, and it depends on the pest. Pests that get into onions tend to only get into onions or that family: onions, garlic, leek, chives, things like that. And so if you know, you kind of want to know your plant families, at least for your main crops. And there's only a few when it comes to our gardens. One of the big families is cucurbits. And so it would be cucumbers, melons, and then here's a picture of some winter squash. And this is to kind of prove another point, is that our names are a little confusing. We'd call all of those winter squash: butternut, kabocha, spaghetti squash, delicata. There's even a little carnival, a pumpkin. Those are all winter squash, right? But it's actually 3 different species. And Cucurbita maxima, that's the kabochas, the buttercup, squash, blue Hubbard. Those are my favorite. And unfortunately, those are the favorite of a lot of pests and a lot of diseases. Cucurbita pepo is kind of intermediate. And then Cucurbita moschata, that's like your butternut. Those tend to be very disease and pest resistant. So, and butternut, that's a great squash. So thank goodness that they are, if you have issues, right, maybe you should go towards the butternuts and really try to change your garden up for that. And it's one of those things that it's hard to know that those are 3 different species. You wouldn't have guessed it just by looking at them. But the trick is actually to look at the stem and where the stem meets the plant. But that's a diversion. We don't want to dwell on that. The flip side of that is that brassicas, most of our common brassica crops, there's actually a lot more than what I'm showing here, of course, but all of these are sort of our European bred brassica crops, and they all came from the same exact plant, this wild sea kale or sea cabbage it was called. And when you breed it for the flower, you can get cauliflower, broccoli. If you breed it for the leaves, you can get kale, or if for a headed up leaf, that's the cabbage, or for the side shoots, that's Brussels sprouts, or for the stem, that's kohlrabi. That's all the same exact species. So if one pest can get into one of those crop types, it probably can get into all of them. And that's one of the things you want to think about, right? If flea beetle like cabbage, they also like broccoli. What flea beetle actually like more than any of these are some other brassica species like bok choy or some of the arugula, some of the Asian greens. So that's just one thing to keep in mind, right? And you don't have to know it all off the top of your head, but it's something you're going to want to learn as you go. And it's, I think, part of the fun of gardening, right? There's so much to learn as you go and as you go. Now, here we are back to our list, but we're actually sticking with know what you have, because all we did right now was knowing our crops. I saw a little question in the chat. My flea beetles target radishes. It's because they're a brassica, and flea beetles love brassicas. They like radishes a lot. So here we have a little test for you. Pest, pathogen, or what? In the top left, that's actually phosphorus deficiency. So that purpling. Then we'll go to the top right. Looks like it could be a disease, right? That's actually potassium deficiency. It's called potassium burn. The bottom left, that one looks like a pretty nasty disease. Actually, hopper burn. It's damage from leaf hoppers feeding on potato. So potato leaf hopper will cause hopper burn, and we'll get into that more later. Bottom on the one on the bottom right, again, looks like a pretty nasty disease. That's blossom end rot, and that's a physiological thing that usually comes from uneven watering. It's usually worse the first tomatoes of the season. So that you kind of want to know, what are you looking at? And of course, you won't know it. Again, if you're a new gardener, you can't be expected to know it off the bat. But these are the things you want to think of. You don't want to jump to conclusions immediately. If you see this bug right here, is that a pest? Or it's actually a spiny soldier bug, and that is a beneficial. It will eat other pest insects. So you wouldn't want to kill that. You wouldn't want to spray it. You'd want to encourage it really. Here it's a little blurry, but you can see that flyish looking, bee-ish looking thing on a zinnia. That is a syrphid fly. Again, another beneficial. What about this one on the right? That one's sort of a throw your hands up. It's not necessarily bad, but it does like to feed on sweet potatoes and morning glories. So if you're growing a lot of sweet potatoes and you see this putting a bunch of holes in them, well, then it might be a little bit of a pest. But then if you think about your sweet potato, it doesn't really matter if the leaves get holes in it. And actually, unless you have a crazy, crazy, crazy infestation, and I've never heard of that being that big of a problem, especially not up here in the Northeast with this tortoise beetle. It's called a golden tortoise beetle. It's not really going to affect your yield. So you probably don't need to worry about controlling it. It's worth knowing what it is though, right? You see it causing holes. You just don't want to jump to conclusions. You want to figure out what that is. So then if you found out, okay, it is a pest, it is going to cause real damage, it's going to be something I need to control or manage somehow. The first questions are really going to be about its life cycle. Where does it overwinter? I mean, if it doesn't, does it overwinter right where it was? That's going to affect your rotation. If you know that it was overwintering, then you know you're probably going to see it in the spring. If it's something like that potato leafhopper I showed earlier, those don't overwinter here. So it doesn't really matter where you rotate to because they're flying in from elsewhere every year. And so we kind of think of this, a lot of these slides are borrowed from Eric Seidman, my predecessor at MOFGA. This is his pest life cycle. You know, in the winter, they're overwintering, they're just surviving. Maybe it's here, maybe it's somewhere down south, and then they're gonna come up later. They come up, they infest or they infect, and then depending on the pest, they may have 1, 2, 3 different generations over the summer. Many generations, you can really population boom, and that can be a problem. That's why you want to control it early, get ahead of it. And then of course they hole up again in the fall. And that's potentially, for something that's overwintering here, that's a potential way to control them, is if you can reduce the spots where they want to overwinter. So this gets us back to our pest, our spinach leaf miner. If you know you've had it in the past, then you know it can overwinter, then you know you've got to be on the lookout. So you want to scout. I should have written on the slide somewhere scouting, but it's really just, you know, now that you know that there are these little white eggs that can be on the bottom of your spinach leaf or your beet leaf, once in a while, walk through the garden when you're watering or you're weeding, flip the leaves over, take a look. If you can catch them in this stage, you can do a lot better control. Once they're in that leaf, really hard to control. There is a spinosad product, Monterey Garden insect spray. If you can spray it on the leaves when they're still just eggs, you can actually kill them. So if you have too many to control by hand, you can kill them. If you know that they're overwintering and then you've just moved to another bed and then you row cover and exclude the adult, and then it's not going to be a problem because the pest won't be there or they can't get in. So here's a Sun Tzu Art of War quote, because a lot of times when we talk about pests, it's hard to avoid that war mentality. If you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result. But if you only know yourself and not the enemy, you know, you're only going to win half the time, maybe. You really got to know what pests you're dealing with and what situations. So here's a list of a bunch of resources. If you're not already signed up for the MOFGA Pest Report, it's an email newsletter that I put together every 2 weeks. You can go to MOFGA. You can really just Google MOFGA and Pest Report, and that'll get you to this page. And there's a big sign up button right here. We archive all the old reports you can see on the left. So really great for new gardeners is look at last year and look at some of the pest reports for the dates coming up. So, you know, I don't always get the information out as early as I'd like. It doesn't always get there before the pest does, unfortunately. But what I'm trying to do is I have weekly phone calls with extension folks around New England, and I try to get, we talk about what pests and what diseases are popping up around the region, as well as around the country and what's maybe headed our way. So I try to get that out to you. as well as some things that we just know are always going to be an issue around certain times of the year. The other one, if you Google MOFGA vegetable pest and disease calendar, and Hillary might be able to put this link up in the chat. This is an article that Eric, my predecessor, had put together, and it's actually a really big, long table, and it's just, you know, the different weeks of the growing season. What are some pests to look for? What crops? And it's a really brief, or no, it's just a good spot to start, you know. Oh, it's the second week of June. It's the first week of June. What should I be looking for? The Northeast Vegetable and Strawberry Pest ID Guide is a nice guide if you want. It's not, it's a little, it's good for if you have some time. So the way it works is it's just, you can flip through it and say, okay, I'm looking at broccolis. All right, broccolis, what pests, what pests, what pests? And then does the picture look like what you're seeing? And it helps get you in that range. If you want to purchase that, you can get that from the MOFGA website. You can get it elsewhere as well. It should be the same price. If you buy it through us, we just see a tiny little benefit. Some folks, if you're not familiar with Reddit, I would say maybe don't go down that way, because Reddit can be weird. There's, it's a big open world with good things and bad things. However, this subreddit is called What's This Bug? And this is one of the good things. And you can just post a picture and say, what is this? And folks out there who geek out on these things will say, oh, that's this. But you have to take it with a grain of salt, because it's just strangers on the internet. And someone might say, oh, it's this, and you need to do this. And somebody else will say, no, they're totally wrong. It's this, you need to do that. So it helps you narrow it down, though, if you're really stuck. But a lot of the common ones you'll be able to find without even going here. This is more for if you have something really unusual. Okay, back to our list of practices and theory. So sanitation. I saw someone asked about squash bugs, and that's timely because we're about to get into it. Here's a gnarly picture of squash bugs hitting up a yellow zucchini. If anyone's had squash bugs, you know, it's kind of gross, and they can actually do a pretty big amount of damage. Their population builds up quickly. You can see this is all the offspring of one squash bug, and just look how many there are. And every single one of them is going to cause damage every feeding spot they have along the fruit. And eventually they're going to kill the whole plant. The adult is down here on the right, and it lays clusters of eggs. And you can see as the eggs are getting closer to hatching, that's what they look like. So this is another one. If you can scout, you can see the eggs on the underside of squash leaves. And the sooner you catch them, if you can control that, control that one adult and that big clutch of eggs, that's a many more adults that you're going to have to deal with later if you don't control them. So it's a sucking insect. It pierces the plant and sucks cell contents out. They lay their eggs in the spring and the summer. And here's the key to control. Because sprays, organic sprays, don't really work very well on them. There are some you can use, and they might have some effect, but it's not very satisfactory. And there's going to be some unintended consequences, killing some other other insects that you didn't want to kill. So the best thing is sanitation. Remove all that crop debris at the end of the year. And don't just put it on top of the compost pile, because they're just going to continue to overwinter it in the debris on that pile. And a lot of home gardens don't have really hot home compost, so it's not going to be killing things the way that like a commercial or farm compost operation would. If you can't do that, maybe you have an end of the year bonfire, you throw it on. Maybe if you're in town, I hate to say it, but hopefully you have a composting service you could bring it to, and they'll compost it hot enough to kill the pest. Otherwise, you might have to throw it out or do something else. You know, run it over with the lawnmower a bunch and really chip it and get it mulched into the soil. Row covers, if you can get your squash planted out, cover it in an area where you weren't growing squash before, right? So you're rotating somewhere else, so it shouldn't have overwintered there. Row cover it before an adult can fly over and find it and lay its eggs. And then squash eggs, if you see them. Another tip someone had was put duct tape around your hands, sticky side out, and that helps you pull the eggs off the leaf a little faster. it's really great to use mulch whenever we can, but if you've had a history of a lot of squash bugs, avoid mulch because it's just providing habitat for them and they're living in it. So take a year or two away from mulch. And then the other thing is because they like to hide in spots like that, you can lay boards out or something like the bark off of a piece of firewood and they'll hide under that. And every morning you can come out, lift it up, and you're going to see a whole bunch of them and squish them. You'll know that you can squish them right there or knock them into a pail of soapy water, something like that. So pesticides, you can try them, but I don't even recommend it. Most folks are not finding it successful, but you would try pyrethrum for this. Pyganic is the most common brand. So moving on from sanitation, barriers, exclusion. I was mentioning this earlier with that you can use row cover, floating row cover. Flea beetle, this is my preferred way of controlling or dealing with flea beetle. As soon as you seed arugula or radishes, put row cover on top of it before the flea beetles can find it. If you're transplanting, transplant and put the row cover on right away. Another option other than row cover is exclusion netting. It's a little more expensive, but it's very effective and it doesn't keep the plants as hot. One thing, row cover is also used for frost protection, so it keeps a little warmth in underneath it. Exclusion netting does as well, but it has a bit more airflow, so it dries out a little bit better. It doesn't hold too much heat, and brassicas don't like heat. Brassicas, which are the plants that flea beetles really love. And if you take care of it, it will last longer than row cover, is what a lot of people are reporting. You just have to treat it gently. And you can see row cover is kind of this spun-bound fabric. It's not really woven, whereas this has like a stitch or a weave or a knit or something to it, which makes it a little stronger, I think. And that's what's allowing the air flow through. And there you see flea beetle. It wants to get in under it, but it can't get in. Onion maggot is another one where row cover can really help. So if you see there's an onion transplant probably that's really suffering already, and the maggot comes in, a fly lands, it lays its eggs near the base of the plants, and these maggots will get in down at the root and they'll start feeding on the roots and they can really set the plants back or just totally kill them. Similar to onion maggot is cabbage maggot. It likes the Brassica family. And then the seed corn maggot is more of a generalist. All three of these species, the adults look, I mean, specialists can tell them apart. I couldn't. I would just say, oh, that looks like a housefly. So if you can, there's a couple different ways to manage it. The flies emerge in the early spring. They actually have multiple generations, but they don't do well in hot soil. So it's that early spring one that does the most damage. Also, that's when your plants are the smallest and most susceptible. They lay their eggs, the maggots hatch, blah, blah, blah. If you can row cover it, here's row cover with nice hoops to keep it off the crop. Before the flies are flying, then they can't find the crop. They can't lay their eggs. They're not a problem. On a small scale, you could do collars like this, and that'll also help protect from cutworm, if you've ever had cutworm. The other thing is timing your planting, and I get into that in the pest report when I talk about these, so I won't talk about it now. And then good sanitation, just you don't want to leave those crops in after you've harvested. Like if you cut your broccoli, then take the whole broccoli plant out. You don't want to keep feeding them. I believe those collars are made out of like a paper product, but you could make your own out of cardboard or some sort of boxboard type cardboard. Leaf miner, again, that's where row cover is great. If the fly can't find the plants, it can't lay the eggs, and it's not an issue. Cucumber beetles, this is another one where row cover is my preferred way of dealing with them. A lot of pesticides, organic pesticides, don't do much against the cucumber beetle. And the big issue with cucumbers, of course, you don't want the feeding, and if they feed on cucumbers themselves, they can cause a little scarring, but it's really just cosmetic. The big issue is if they get on a cucumber plant while it's still young, or a squash plant while it's still young, and they can transmit bacterial wilt disease. So it's actually the disease transmitted by the beetle that is the big problem. And the plants are most susceptible when they're really small. So if you put your plants out, you row cover them, keep the cucumber beetle out, And then you, of course, have to take the row cover off when they're flowering because you need them to pollinate to get good fruit set. By that point, the plant is much more resistant to the bacterial wilt, and it's not as big of a problem. And then rotating if you can to get away from cucumber beetles. Often it's either a good year or a bad year for cucumber beetles, and there's only so much you can do other than try to exclude them. Some of the caterpillars that get at our brassica crops, cabbage worm, diamondback moth, you know, there's a couple different control options, but they are coming from moths that lay eggs. So when you see these kind of look pretty little white caterpillars flying around your, or moths flying around your garden, you know, it'd be really great if you had some row cover so that moth can't land on your crop, even though they're very pretty. I'm hopeful that as my children grow up, they can get some butterfly nets and really catch them for me. And then a question about row covers. If you already have flea beetles or other pests, it is a little too late. It's kind of, there's not much you can do at that point other than try to pick things thoroughly and get your next planting more prepared. Because if you have flea beetles emerging out of the soil, that part of their life cycle is in the soil as well, and you put a row cover over them and they have the food source under the row cover, you just made a flea beetle hotel. So, you know, row cover, you got to be ahead of it. That's that whole prevention is worth a pound of cure. Biological control. A lot of this is more on the farm scale, where in greenhouses is where it really shines, because you have a little more control. Your biological control agents don't just fly away. In a garden, though, we have those two that I mentioned earlier. There's many other beneficials. It's hard to know them all, though. It's a lot more sticks in your head, the bad ones, right? But if you see egg cases like this on a tomato hornworm, that tomato hornworm has been parasitized. So you want to leave it so that those can complete their life cycle and go parasitize any more that might appear in your garden. Same with Japanese beetle. This is parasitized, and so you want that to live long enough for the parasite to complete its life cycle, or at least get to the next part of its life cycle where it's infecting other Japanese beetles. And that's kind of, you want to promote these things as much as you can, and often that means having continuous supply of pollen and nectar. So I plant dill and cilantro, I harvest them, but then when they bolt and they start flowering, I just let them go. And the parasitic wasps love them, and then those are helping to give me some pest control, as well as pollinators love them. Then when we get into, here's where we get into kind of our pesticide options, you know, because that's really our last choice. We're trying to do all the recommended things that we can beforehand, so that we're not having to do a rescue situation. So microbial pesticides, Bt and spinosad are the most common that we talk about. Bt is from a specific bacteria that it creates a toxin that when it gets into a larval stage of a pest, and usually the most common one is for caterpillar pests, and they have a basic stomach chemistry, whereas we have like an acidic stomach chemistry. So if we swallowed that toxin, it wouldn't do anything to us because it's not actually toxic in the form that you apply it. But if it goes into a basic stomach, like a caterpillar stomach, it would then become, it gets converted into its toxic form. And so I see someone in the chat asking, isn't Bt bad for monarchs? And it can be if it's applied on something they're going to eat. So because it has to get into their stomach to have an effect, you have to get it onto your crop while the caterpillar is still small enough that it's feeding. And B, you don't want to put it on something like, you wouldn't want to put it on milkweed, because then a monarch caterpillar which feeds on that could eat it and be damaged. However, if a monarch butterfly lands on your crop and there's Bt on it, it's not going to do anything because it's not eating that, it's eating nectar. And then spinosad is another bacterial product, and that's more of a broad spectrum. So I like to think of that as your real last resort, because it can kill other things that you don't want it to kill. It could kill bees or some of your beneficials. Um, and again, you're going to want to follow all label instructions. So BT, there's several different brands. Monterey is just one of them. I'm just showing it as an example. You can buy this. You have to buy one that's labeled for home use. I'm assuming I have a primarily garden audience here. So you're going to want one that's labeled for home garden use, and you have to follow all the labels, because those are actually legal documents. It is federal law that you have to follow the label instructions. So if it doesn't say that you can use it on your crop, then you can't use it, something like that. And then spinosad, the most common, this is probably the most common brand for your garden, is Monterey Garden Insect Spray. And that farmers, if you hear us talking about farmers using Entrust, this is kind of the garden version that you're allowed to use without getting a special pesticide applicator's license that a farmer needs to use Entrust. Highly effective on these cabbage worms and diamondback moth worms. You know, I say worms, but it's a caterpillar. And then highly effective on hornworms. Usually, you know, you only have so many tomatoes that you can usually just control these by hand, but they can be hard to spot. And if you have too many to control, then a BT spray is going to be highly effective. For both these pests, BT is the way to go, because it's more selective, right? It's only going to be a problem for a caterpillar species. It's not going to be an issue for a bee, for example. And then if you only want to spray your crop where you know, and so that if a caterpillar is actually eating that leaf, well, that's exactly what you want to target. So you want to make sure it's only on the leaves that you want to target. And then shortly after it's been applied, it's going to be, this might have been BT or it might have been spinosad, that Monterey Garden Insect Spray for this hornworm. I don't remember which, but either way, the end result is the same. You get very dead. Colorado potato beetle is probably one that folks here know or have seen. That's the adult stage. These overwinter in the soil. That's actually one of the best ways to avoid them. Here's the pupal stage, is to think about they're overwintering, they're in soil, so they're going to emerge where they were the previous year. They really like potatoes, but they also like eggplant, which, in case you didn't know, are the same family. So they like that family. And so wherever you had potatoes or eggplant, and if you had Colorado potato beetle, that's probably where they're going to emerge again the next spring. That first emerging population, most of them don't bother flying. They just walk looking for the next potato plant to infect. So if you can move and rotate somewhere else and then put up some sort of barrier, a ditch, a big open grassy stretch where you're going to keep your eyes open to see them, something, then you can control them a little bit better. Some of our controls, again, if it's garden scale, you can do, especially if it's early in the season, if you can catch them before they're laying a bunch of eggs, hand picking is going to have a big impact. If the adults are just emerging, you know, now in Massachusetts, so that means they might be starting in southern Maine already. Now's the time to start looking. If you can hand pick those adults before they can mate and they can lay eggs, you're going to be in great shape. Mulching, so that you can prevent them from getting into the ground to complete their life cycle. Delay your planting. Like I said, right now they're out, they're going to start coming out, they're going to start looking. If you don't plant your potatoes for another couple weeks, it's going to be a lot harder for them to find them, and they may die or move on looking for somebody else's potatoes. And then that rotation, as I was saying. Okay, somebody's saying there's already some potato beetle in North Yarmouth. And then botanical sprays. That'd be pyrethrum, which is made out of chrysanthemum flowers, or neem oil, which comes from the neem tree. Neem is potentially effective. I don't normally use it. I'm not sure. Maybe I just don't know enough of how to use it well. I don't find it great. Pyrethrum is really just like spinosad is kind of broad spectrum. Pyrethrum really is. It's a pretty toxic thing. Luckily, in the organic form, pyganic, it only has a short residual. It's only going to be like potent for a few days. Read the label. It will have instructions of how long, what harvest interval to worry about, or reapplication intervals. But I don't want to spray it unless I absolutely have to. It's just take care with it. It's not, just because it comes from a flower doesn't mean it's a nice thing. And neem oil, while the label is a legal document and how you use the product, what they say it's effective on isn't necessarily legally verified. So, I would just use it with caution. Maybe it helps. I'd love to know if folks say it has absolutely worked wonders for X, Y, or Z. Throw that into the chat. All right, so here we're getting back to, here's our example of one of our early example of, right, is this a pest or is this a disease? This is hopper burn, and it comes from potato leaf hoppers. The plant on the top is our potato plant, and then over here is a bean plant, because despite the name potato leaf hopper, they also really like beans, even though they're totally different plant families. They also like strawberries, they like alfalfa, so they're a little less picky. What looks like that disease, that burn, is caused by this little tiny leaf hopper, really hard to see, but if you brush the plants with your hand, they might jump up and fly, and then you might want to flip some leaves over to see if you can find a nymph. And the way you'll know it's a nymph is they actually crawl sideways, kind of like a crab. Instead of running straight away from you, they'll run straight sideways away from you. So when they feed, they actually inject a toxin into the plant, and that's what causes that nasty damage. One of the things, that healthy plant, right? This Satina variety, right next to Purple Majesty, you can tell which one's the susceptible variety, which one's the resistant variety. They both suffered some damage, but you're gonna get better performance out of that resistant variety. So some of the controls are row cover. If you don't have them yet, row cover. I actually know a farmer who doesn't grow too many potatoes, so this isn't crazy for him. Up north where they do huge acreages of potatoes, they're not gonna do this, but he row covers his potatoes and just leaves them covered the entire time, because potatoes don't need to be pollinated. He would remove the row cover to weed and check on things, fertilize if he needed to, but then he would put the row cover back down. And he had no hopper burn, and he said for him, it was worth it. But this is one where pyrethrum is like your really only good chemical control. The trick is that you need to, once they've already started feeding, when you spot them, often it's too late. So you kind of have to know when they're going to be in the area. And as I had mentioned briefly earlier, they fly up from the Gulf of Mexico. So you can't just rely on, oh, it's about that time of the year, because some years they come up early on a storm, other years they don't. And so it's going to vary year by year. So this is one of those reasons why I say, please sign up for the pest report. I'll let you know when the potato leaf hopper is making its way. When they see it in Connecticut, I'm going to put it out in the pest report, so you know it's probably here up in the trees getting ready, or it's about to be here. And so you want to start scouting either very regularly and then just, be ready to go, be prepared. So again, back to our disease triangle, just to mention diseases a little bit. I'm going to try to wrap up really quick. We're almost at the end, I promise. The idea that, you need all three of these things. You need the susceptible host, the conducive environment, and the pest present. Botrytis gets into a lot of plants, but it's kind of everywhere. You can't rotate away from botrytis. It's always in the environment. However, it has very specific environment that it needs in order to infect your plant. So it needs a film of moisture on the plant or really high relative humidity for at least 8 or 12 hours. And the temperature has to be between 55 and 75. So a greenhouse grower will manipulate their environment, right? They'll make sure that it's never that wet for that long or that humid for that long. Or if they know they can't help it, then they might put the heat up to 76, 77. You might use row cover for the same thing. But this, it's just that idea, right? Like the pest can be there, the plant can be susceptible, but if the environment's not right, it's not going to get there. And I'm going to breeze through some of this because this talk wasn't really so much about disease, but I wanted to throw these in There's a couple different ways diseases get in. Through a wound, which is why you always want to remove damaged leaves if you can. If there's sunburn on it, that counts as a wound that a disease can enter in more easily. And then in these diagrams, it's a representation of fungal disease on the left and bacterial disease on the right. That's a spore germinating and getting in. Stomata, those are the openings in plant leaves that they breathe out of. Hydothodes, which I'll show you in a second what those are. And they are, it's the way plants, well, I'll show you in a second. And then direct penetration, only fungus can do this. And that's when it needs that water film for the spore lands. There's enough moisture, it germinates, and it can actually dissolve away the plant leaf and get its way in. So that's why you want to reduce leaf wetness as much as possible, because this is one of the most common ways for most of our common diseases, which are the fungal diseases. If there's enough leaf wetness, spore can germinate and it can actually dissolve its way in. And then hydothodes, this is just kind of also a fun thing. This is where plants exude water when they have too much water pressure built up. This is another picture from an old garden of mine. That's broccoli in the early morning. So the water on top of the leaf, that's dew, right? But those big droplets on the side of the leaf, that's the plant being like, I have too much water, I'm not photosynthesizing, I need to get rid of this water, otherwise my cells are gonna burst. And so if you think about all that water with a big opening in the leaf to get in or out of the leaf, and also as the sun shines again and it starts warming up, that water, those droplets can suck back into the leaf. That's how black rot, which is a bacterial disease, usually gets into our brassicas. And so you recognize black rot usually because it shows up on those leaf margins. See how the edges of the leaves? It's because it was water on those hydothodes and then sucked the water back in with the bacteria in it. So if you have any black rot like this, touch that plant last thing in the garden, and be ripping that plant out while you do it, because that bacteria, if it hits any moisture on the other plant, or if it can hang out on the leaf until the plant exudes some moisture and sucks it back in, you're just going to spread it. And you're the one doing the spreading usually. Okay, so there's the MOFGA, my address, the pest report address, and there's a button on there. It should be, there's the archive and what the pest report is, and above that blurb and below that blurb should be a little greenish button, I think it's green, that says sign up for the pest report. And then if you use Instagram, I occasionally post things as organic crop specialist, which hopefully is useful. I don't know, give me feedback. It's kind of an experiment. And I'll stop sharing and we can get into stuff. All right, it wasn't 45 minutes, but I wasn't a full hour either.
No, that was great. Thanks so much, Caleb. I think you were doing a great job of monitoring the chat while you were going. There were a few questions that I feel like you may have missed, although I had to step out for a minute, so I also could be wrong. The ones I noted, somebody was asking for more detail on squash bugs.
I think that was before I talked about squash bugs.
Okay, yeah, great. And then I noticed somebody was asking about whether it's possible for an adult to lay an egg through row cover. Did you cover that as well?
I didn't cover that. So row cover is so tightly bonded and spun, I don't think they could do it. That protect net, I think it's possible, like if you had the leaf right up against it, but I've never heard of it happening. So I think it's a really minor potential. It's still possible, like if a moth lands on the net and it's trying to get at the broccoli crop underneath it, it might be able to lay its egg, but I would be really surprised. And I haven't heard of it.
Okay, great. And then I think we have a couple general questions that have just come in about corn and tomato blight.
Yeah. Oh, I see one. I'm trying to go from the bottom, or from the older to newer. I see one about, I think it was about flea beetles. And can they arrive in the roots and soils of seedlings that you buy? It's possible, but if they were in that, it would be in the potting mix, and it's not going to come in the potting mix unless it's already on the plant. And so you'll see the damage on the plant if that's the case. So you'll see little like shotgun holes, little BB, like somebody shot it with a bunch of BBs. These little tiny round holes is what the flea beetle damage looks like. And then it could have potentially laid eggs that dropped into the potting soil, but I think that's pretty rare usually. Gardener size row cover. It's hard to, a lot of the seed companies, Johnny's sells road cover, Fedco sells road cover. It's more expensive than farmers buy it, but that's because they're buying a lot larger quantity. So, it's one of those, just not too much you can do. Du Bois Ag, I'll put it, there's a company that makes ProtectNet. I think that's the right address. I just threw into the chat. They have some smaller size packages. Entrust for flea beetles, it could work. I know it can do some. Entrust, and again, that would be on the farm scale. So at the home gardener scale would be Monterey Garden insect spray. So a spinosad product. I know folks have tried it, and I know folks have been disappointed, I guess is what I should say. It might have some impact, but really probably what you see is that generation dies off, and then the next generation is in the soil ready to pop up later. So flea beetle, you can also kind of get away with some timing. They tend to come in waves, but if you have a lot of them built up, then it gets harder because you might have this wave and then that wave comes right behind it. And so you have a sort of a constant supply of them. There's also several species of flea beetles. So, they're not all going to do exactly the same thing. Take a dust buster out to get striped cucumber beetles. That's great. If you're at the scale where you can do that, that's a really great way to do it. And hand control really works a lot, often for beetles, because they don't move that fast. So either picking them by hand and dropping them in soapy water, or a dust buster is a great idea. And that includes like asparagus beetle, Colorado potato beetle, cucumber beetle, if you can get them early enough. Someone's asking about rhubarb tea. Technically, that's illegal because anytime you're spraying something to kill a plant, then it has to be EPA registered. And so I have to tell you, it's my responsibility and duty to tell you, you technically, legally can't do that because flea beetle, rhubarb tea can be pretty toxic. And really what the government's concerned about is that you could be poisoning yourself or your family. I see another source of where you can get row cover. Great. Catnip tincture for flea beetles. I had never heard of that. That's interesting. Can corn have too much water? Is that true of all plants? Yeah, the biggest issue with too much water is actually lack of oxygen around the roots. And then there's other issues like if it's been really dry and then you put a ton of water on your tomatoes and they're fairly ripe, the plants are going to take up so much water, they're going to split. The fruit will split. And you'll see that some varieties are more and less susceptible to that. That's usually described in the catalog. And then of course, leaf wetness, as I said, you want to water when the plant can dry off to reduce risk of disease. What is helpful for tomato blight? And this is where I should say we talk about early blight and late blight for tomatoes, and they're totally different pests. Early blight is always around. It's really hard to get away from it. That being said, you want to rotate, get away from where you planted tomatoes previously. And then it lives in the soil on infected leaf debris. And the first rains of the season, they hit that, they splash spores up onto the plant. And then if it's wet enough, those spores germinate, they infect, and those create their own spores, and the plant just the disease creeps its way up the plant. So you want to minimize wet leaves, maximize airflow, get it to dry out as much as possible, prune your tomatoes, a nice straw mulch or any mulch, anything to really, if you have that much mulch over your soil, those spores are buried and they can't splash up as easily. It'll probably still find you, but hopefully you've delayed it enough. And that's the real trick with early blight, is just delay it as long as possible. In a year like this, it's been so dry that you probably don't have much of it going right now. And then when it is bad, you can use a copper fungicide. So I don't remember the brand names for home gardener scale, but you can, if it's OMRI approved, if there's a little logo on it that says OMRI, OMRI, that means it's allowed for use in organic production, and just find a copper fungicide and it'll work. And follow the rules, because copper, it is a heavy metal and you don't want to use more of it than you need to. Grasshoppers is one of those ones where they're so hit or miss that it's hard to have, that there aren't many, most folks haven't bothered with figuring out how best to control grasshoppers. So if you have a problem with it, email me and I'll do more research and I'll get back to you with a better answer. Slug and snail prevention suggestions. A lot of that's about habitat, and slugs, they're really soft-bodied. They need moisture. So if you can make your garden as much of a desert, except for watering your plants as much as they need, you're gonna reduce them. On the flip side of that, if you make your garden more of a habitat for toads and snakes, garter snakes, they love eating slugs. The chemical control would be iron phosphate baits, and that's Sluggo, and you can find some that are OMRI listed. And once the slug or snail eats those, they stop eating, and so they'll still be alive for a few days, but they won't actually be feeding on your plants. The other thing, like the squash beetles, where I was saying you could take like the bark off of a piece of firewood or something and put it out in between your rows, you can do that, and you'll find in the morning, that's where the slugs are hiding, so they don't dry out during the day. Whoop, get rid of them. If you have chickens, feed them to the chickens. Ton of alder flea beetles last year. Do I need to worry about anything in the garden from them? I've never heard of alder flea beetles, so I'm guessing it's particular to alders. It's not that specific species. I haven't heard of being a garden pest any more so than any other flea beetle or at all. So we can look into it more. If you email me to remind me, then I'll definitely look into it. But otherwise, I would say don't worry about it unless you see them. A bed that had tulips with a bad case of botrytis. Will anything I plant in that bed also suffer from botrytis? That botrytis is probably around anyway, so it's going to be more about, is it a good year for botrytis or a bad year? And if it's a bad year where there's a lot of moisture that just keeps raining, you might want to try a copper fungicide. And particularly on something like tulips where you're not going to eat them, then you really don't have to worry as much about the copper residue. And then late tomato blight. Oh, that's right. I forgot to cover the other half of the tomato blight. So late blight is a different type of fungus that really shows up most in cool, wet conditions. It's not a very tough spore. It needs moisture. It dries out. A spring like this, if it were present here, it would be like dead. But when it's a really rainy year, and if it's present, it can be a real issue. So because it's not a very tough spore, there's no overwintering stage that can survive up here, at least not at present time. There's a chance that can happen in the future, but let's just hope we keep controlling it. So the one way it can show up here, well, there's a couple ways. One way that it shows up here more naturally is if you have potatoes from last year and they were infected. It tends to not get to New England until the end of the year, which is why we call it late blight instead of early blight, which shows up a lot earlier. But say we had a bad fall and we had late blight and you saved some of your own potatoes to plant as seed, you might have a potato that's infected with late blight, and then you let that germinate and grow the next summer, and boom, there goes all your potatoes and your tomatoes and all of your neighbors, and the whole state and the entire potato industry is very mad at you. Not that they necessarily know it's you. They're very mad it happened. It can be really destructive. It's an interesting interesting disease because it's kind of weak in some ways, but once it's got the right conditions, it's incredibly destructive. That's the one that caused the potato famine in Ireland 100 and however many years ago. So we keep an eye on that. And there's actually, if you Google late blight tracker, you can find a map and it shows every county this year that has late blight in it. And right now, I think it's just Florida, maybe Texas. And we keep a close eye on that and we see where it spreads. Last year it scared us. It jumped up to Pennsylvania, New York area, but it never spread beyond that. So I never put it in the pest report. If it were coming closer or the conditions were really right with a big storm coming from that area, I might put it in the pest report, something like that. Do eggshells help with slugs? Yes, temporarily. So especially if you bake them and they're really hard and crispy, it's the sharp edges that deter them. So you would need broken up eggshells and to form like a perimeter around whatever you're trying to protect. And the slugs aren't going to want to cross it. As soon as it rains, those sharp edges are going to get slightly dissolved by the rain and it's not going to be effective anymore. So yes, I've definitely heard that it can be helpful, but it's something that you're going to need to reapply a lot. I mulch a lot and find the slugs hide under the mulch. Yeah, definitely. It is a common issue and a common concern of like when to mulch, when not to mulch. I wouldn't mulch my lettuce because I know it's going to get it's going to be a quick crop anyway, and slugs would really wreck it. When I do get slugs coming into my kale, because I like to mulch that, I usually do a round of Sluggo, that bait, and then that should be it for a while. That's my, it usually, if you do it thoroughly, you control the population in that area. And so it's going to take a while for new slugs or new snails to come into your new garden area. The other thing with Sluggo is that it's made with wheat bran. That's what's attracting them. And so it's a little pellet. And if you let it get wet, it dissolves and it becomes a lot less effective. They're not as attracted to it. So you want to keep it as dry as possible. Don't apply it right before it rains, that kind of thing. Don't apply it and then water it in. I think that's it on the chat questions. Are there any more? If not, I also have some to name if folks are interested. If you're interested, throw it into the chat or throw out more questions. Or throw out more tips and tricks of your own.
I have to run, but I just wanted to say thank you so much.
Sure. Okay, I see 2 yeses. I guess I should have also said no if you're, or you could just, you could leave the Zoom session if you're done. Yeah, like we didn't have enough pests already. And then I believe you're going to get an email with a link to the recording. So I'll share my screen again. The new pests are ones that, they may not hit your garden this year, but just in case they do, I want you to tell me about it so that we can track their spread. We're trying to keep an eye on it and warn people before it's a real problem. So the first one is called Swede midge, and it's a tiny, midge, like a little fly. It's a tiny, tiny little fly, it's smaller than a black fly. And they get into everything in the Brassica family. And what happens is they lay their eggs somewhere on the growing plant, and their larvae secrete these digestive enzymes, and that dissolves part of the plant. So if you see, this should have been a broccoli head coming up, and instead there's corky, callus scarring, and then weird side shoots coming out as the plant's trying to grow normally, even though its apical bud, its normal growing point, has been dissolved. And here's another one. You see like leaf curling, that scarring. So if they're really hard to catch these because they're so small. So there's that scarring in the middle where the broccoli head would be, and then scarring and leaf curling over on the right. So this map is not a picture of their current distribution. This was because it's a European pest originally, and it got introduced to Canada. And so what some scientists did was they looked at the conditions of where it does live naturally, where it evolved in, and they applied that to our own environment. And they said, oh, this is where it could spread. So it's going to be, the fact that it started in Canada and has been a problem there shows that it's going to be more than happy to be here in Maine. And it has already started to be a problem here. There's the adult fly. You'll never see it, and you'll never be able to distinguish it from any other tiny little fly. But if you see some of that damage and you look at the plant, there's the larvae, just these tiny little maggots. They are teeny, teeny, tiny. Really hard to see. This is the inside of a cabbage bud. So that's not like big leaves. That's the really tiny leaves in the middle. You have to kind of pry it apart to find them buried in there. And yeah, you can see it makes the plant really gross. And so because they get in, they're so small and they get in really far and it's hard to see that they're there. It's hard to control them organically, which is why we're trying to let folks know before it's a problem. The other big pest, I should also say that those Swede midge have made it, they're in Aroostook, on the eastern side of Aroostook County. They came over from Canada there. And then they're in the northwest of Maine, like Rangeley area, all the way, they've made it all the way down into Farmington, which is a little concerning. That means they're going to be able to keep moving, and they're probably going to start moving into our more populated areas and where more of our farms are. Leek moth, this is just the potential distribution, not the current distribution. This one has only just barely made it into Maine. There's the adult. It only flies at night. So leek moth, as the name suggests, they like the onion family. They like leeks, garlic, and chives. They really like leeks though. And there's the larvae, and that's what does the damage. So the moths fly at night. They find the allium host and they lay their eggs, which is in some ways great because that means we can at least do row cover or that exclusion netting. And again, they're mating. If they can't find the host, they can't get to it. This is what the feeding damage can look like inside a leek. And oops, I think I messed up the animations. There's a map in the back of where it's gotten in Vermont or in Maine. No, wait, no, here it is. So it's come in a little bit up here in Somerset near Jackman, and it's gotten into Franklin around Rangeley, but that's it so far. We're hoping it doesn't make the jump into the next farms and keep spreading, but if you see any damage like that, please do let us know. Here it is in garlic, chewing its way through. Again, I'm always happy to get a picture of something where you're like, is this leek moth? And I can say, no, it's this. Or, oh my gosh, yes, it is. Let's talk more. Allium leaf miner, not in Maine yet. Thank goodness. See that little tiny, it's like a caterpillar, but well, it's a larvae, it's a maggot. It's from a fly. And it does like leaf mining like that in an onion leaf. And when the eggs are laid, it makes these interesting scars. So these little circles of bleached out onion leaf, that's where leaf miner eggs have been laid. And that's coming to us from the south. So these other two were coming in from Canada, and this one's coming from Pennsylvania originally. And it has already made it to Berkshire County in Massachusetts. So we're keeping an eye on it. The folks at UMass Extension are scouting for it all the time, and so far it hasn't spread beyond Berkshire County, but that'll be true until it's not true. So leek moth damage, they can get into an onion leaf and create this sort of window painting, but a leaf miner, allium leaf miner, makes these sort of tunnels, more of a mine. The other big one that isn't really here yet is spotted lanternfly, and you can see over its life cycle it changes dramatically. There's the adult, actually kind of pretty. When its wings are folded, it looks like this. It lays these funky egg masses. See that on the left? That is an egg mass that's well protected. And then they hatch out and they become these little nymphs, and they go through these different life stages. So, I don't think I showed in here, but they get into grapes, apples. They're really generalists. They don't care about what plant family they're on. They just keep feeding on whatever they want to feed on. But the trick is that they evolved in Asia on this tree of heaven tree, which is another invasive species that we're dealing with in the US. And so it was originally thought maybe they needed to feed on this in order to be able to reproduce successfully. They did some testing. It's not true. They don't need to feed on it. They can still reproduce even if they're only feeding on grapes and apples or something like that. However, they don't have as high a reproductive success. So they have a harder time if they don't have this invasive tree as well. So that means if we can keep this invasive tree out, it's a 2-for-1 deal. You don't have the invasive tree, and you don't have, at least you really significantly reduce your chance that the lanternfly is going to be a major problem. So current sightings of tree of heaven, that's showing the entire county, but what actually the only sightings that I know of in Maine are right around Portland. There's been some sightings, and then right around either Bangor or Orono. And so as long as those are contained, and look at how much is on the border with New Hampshire, right? Like, so the more you can educate your friends and your neighbors about tree of heaven, keep it out. It looks like sumac, but the flowers are different. It has a strong odor, kind of smells like cat pee. So when in doubt, take some photos, send them to me, send them to Extension, say, hey, is this tree of heaven? And help your friends and neighbors learn to avoid it as well. Okay, that was my spiel on, like, keep an eye out for these. It's better to not be surprised, right? And then, ooh, what to do about aphids on kale and broccoli? There's a good chance that's cabbage aphid. It's the species, and there's not much you can do. What has actually been proven really successful is beneficial predators. And so what some farms, they're doing this on a commercial scale. They're planting alyssum, sweet alyssum, which is a little pretty flowering brassica plant, and it's really nice. It's a really pretty garden plant, and they're putting it in between their Brussels sprouts, in between their kale plants, and that attracts a lot of predatory insects, and those eat the aphids. If you can't do that, or if it's not working well enough, Impede, I think that's labeled for home gardens, but double check. That's an insecticidal soap. And then Pyganic is the other one that people use, that pyrethrum that I said I try to avoid if possible. So people do, Impede one spray, and then they wait, and then they do Pyganic. And if you do Pyganic over and over and over again, they will actually become resistant to it. That's another reason to avoid using it whenever possible. Save it for when it's really needed. How do you know if the larvae you find in the soil is good or bad? Good question. It's really hard to know. I often don't know. And so I usually leave it unless I can tell. Yeah, I guess that's my honest answer, is that I usually don't know what it is, and so I leave it. There are experts. You can always take a picture and send it to Clay Kirby at UMaine. The UMaine IPM Diagnostic Labs, you can Google that, it'll pop right up. That's where you can send diseased plant samples. And then that's where you can also email photos or send in actual insect samples to Clay Kirby. And that's his job. He identifies insects. He's amazing at it. It's really impressive. Someone just sent me a question. Any problem with Asian jumping worms? So this is a controversial somewhat subject. It's an invasive earthworm. However, every earthworm in Maine is an invasive earthworm. So every worm in your garden was not here before Europeans landed here. There are native earthworms to the North American continent, but our ice age wiped them all out in our area. So they were limited to parts like Long Island South. And they were not making their way up here anytime soon. But then the Europeans landed, they brought their own soil. And so all the earthworms you see, the ones that we grew up with are mostly European species. There are some new invasive earthworms that are Asiatic. And so they're called like crazy snake worms is one of the names. They're pretty wild. You pick them up and they jump around. It's like you have a fish in your hand, a fish out of water. They jump around in your hand. So whether or not it's a problem depends a lot on context. In your garden soil, they're not that big of a problem. They're gonna move your mulch into the soil as organic matter a lot faster, maybe burn it up a little bit faster than you'd like. But other than that, it's going to be like any other earthworm in your soil in a lot of ways. At least that's the best of my current understanding. But in our forest soils, they can be, our forests have evolved to have a big layer of organic matter, a big duff layer. And so earthworms in there, including night crawlers and other ones, it's just these Asian ones are new and they're very fast. They can really move that organic matter down into the soil faster than it would normally happen. And that's the real concern, is that it could have a big ecological impact on our woodlands. So you don't want to spread them any faster than they're already spreading. However, it's really hard to say that, it's really hard to be optimistic that we're going to control that one, because yeah, I just don't know how, we don't really know how they showed up, probably in in potted plants from Asia. So that we don't really know how they're spreading. They're spreading really quickly. If you move mulch from one garden to another garden, you might move them with it. So yeah. Okay, I think I got everybody's.
I think so. I think you've got it all. Gotten them all. I think, it's almost 8 o'clock, so I think we should really tie things up. So thanks again, Caleb. This was really, really instructive. And thanks to everyone for joining us tonight.
Yeah, thank you, everybody.